There's a lot to be hopeful for in terms of the projects that we're seeing. But to put it into context, we're currently investing about 80 to 100 billion dollars per year in building renovations. That's both for the commercial and residential sectors. And according to the most recent article I saw by Corporate Knights, for example, we need to add about 75 billion to that a year to meet our climate goals. So we're seeing movement, but we're only really seeing about half the speed that we really need to in terms of meeting our climate objectives.
Welcome to Sustainability Leaders. I'm Michael Torrance, Chief Sustainability Officer at BMO. On this show, we will talk with leading sustainability practitioners from the corporate, investor, academic, and NGO communities to explore how this rapidly evolving field of sustainability is impacting global investment, business practices, and our world.
The views expressed here are those of the participants and not those of Bank of Montreal, its affiliates, or subsidiaries.
Hi there, my name is George Sutherland, Senior Advisor at BMO. In today's two-part episode series, we'll be talking about trends and opportunities related to reducing emissions from the built environment. To help me unpack this topic, I'm joined by Bryan Flannigan, Executive Director at the Building Decarbonization Alliance, by Max Graham, Chief Operating Officer at Avenue Living, and by James Burrow, Director of Sustainable Finance at BMO. Thank you all for joining me today. Bryan, to begin, can you provide our audience with an overview of the Building Decarbonization Alliance?
Yeah, thanks, George, and thanks for having me on the show. So the Building Decarbonization Alliance is a Canadian not-for-profit. Our main objective is really to advance the decarbonization of buildings through a sort of systems change or market transformation approach. And this approach really places a focus on economy-wide decarbonization, otherwise recognizing that other sectors of our economy need to decarbonize simultaneously to the building sector. And that changes the focus a little bit. Our main sort of approach places a really high emphasis on shifting away from incremental efficiency paradigm, I guess, if you will, toward more of a sort of new carbon elimination paradigm. We think that there's a bit of a game changer there in terms of how we think about doing retrofits and how we move forward. So we convene stakeholders from across the entire building ecosystem to help us identify really pressing issues and high leverage pressure points in the system that can unlock or catalyze change and accelerate adoption of low carbon solutions.
And you've mentioned energy retrofits. Can you describe what's unique about deep energy retrofits, as well as the current rate of deep energy retrofits today, and where this needs to be to align with federal targets?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'd love to start off by saying, this is all well in hand and we're good. And this sector is leading the charge to decarbonize, not only in Canada, but globally. But it's not the case. To put context on it, the building sector is responsible for 89 megatons of emissions, a bit more than half of which is from the commercial sector. And to put that into context, that's about twice as much as the entire electricity system emits in Canada, or it's about the same amount as all on-road vehicle emissions in Canada. So it's one of the major sort of pillars of our emissions nationally. And where do those emissions come from? Well, the commercial buildings consume about 750 petajoules of natural gas. And ultimately, the sector needs to really aggressively work to eliminate this on-site combustion of natural gas, which is responsible for what we call Scope 1 emissions, or the ones that are happening at the site. And this is really where deep retrofits come in. And for those that are sort of new to the idea, a deep retrofit would be a project that results from a really comprehensive review of all energy consuming and GHG emitting equipment, as well as all the future sort of capital renewal requirements for a given building or a portfolio of buildings. Our own contention and observations at the BDA, now that we're into a bit of a shifting paradigm and elimination paradigm, is that these retrofits now need to shift focus to eliminating carbon emissions by really working to retrofit fossil fuel combustion equipment where possible for more efficient technologies like heat pumps, along with supporting demand management technologies like thermal storage, and really leaning into our energy efficiency learnings over the past decades to minimize the impacts on the electricity system. So beyond the lifetime operating cost savings, these projects would also ideally be justified on the basis of future carbon policy and other climate risks by building owners. And I think we're really starting to see that, but it's a real change in focus from sort of the light retrofits that we've seen in the past, where people just change light bulbs or change a few motors.
And just carrying on that thread, where are you seeing the most movement on this in the building sector today?
Yeah, so there is movement for sure. There's a lot to be hopeful for in terms of the projects that we're seeing. But to put it into context, we're currently investing about 80 to 100 billion dollars per year in building renovations. That's both for the commercial and residential sectors. And according to the most recent article I saw by Corporate Knights, for example, we need to add about 75 billion to that a year to meet our climate goals. So we're seeing movement, but we're only really seeing about half the speed that we really need to in terms of meeting our climate objectives. We're seeing things like university campuses across the country are taking on net zero sort of deep retrofit programs and ambitious longer term plans that are driven by strategic visions and the opportunity really to create a test bed for research and best practices. So, for example, Concordia University has a thing called Plan Net Zero, which sets a 2040 net zero goal. So they want to get there 10 years ahead. We're seeing interest in developing decarbonization roadmaps in the commercial office sector, but this sector, I think, is still really facing headwinds from the pandemic. So I think we're still hearing about that particular part of the subsector more in the context of challenges that they're still facing rather than major activity. But we're I think, a lot in our field are really anxiously awaiting for the pipeline of big commercial sector projects to start kicking into gear.
Bryan, can I actually ask you a bit of a question? Because, as I've been thinking about the space for the last couple of years, there was almost this tension, not tension, but dichotomy frame between like a shallow retrofit and a deep retrofit. And a shallow retrofit was sort of a bad thing. It's like, well, you're only doing LED lighting and that's about it. And it will, generate some limited incremental energy improvements, but probably not much decarbonization. And then on the other hand, there was this deep retrofit that was this kind of quite intimidating thing because it involved taking out as much natural gas out of the building as possible, some pretty invasive envelope improvements. And it was a really, this kind of big bang project that really changed a bit, the building. Now, obviously, that's a positive thing, but it's not necessarily super attainable for, in a lot of buildings. So I guess the question I have to you is there a world where there's almost a happy medium between shallow retrofits and deep retrofits where it's just like, look, you're focusing really aggressively on removing natural gas, from the building? Yeah. Is there a kind of middle ground that the market can kind of move towards there? Or should we really be focusing on, these multi-measure projects each and every time there's an opportunity?
Yeah, well, I really think this is where there's a convergence of a few things. Like this idea that we're really into a different paradigm really requires us to shift. And you've, in the framing of your question, you've really encapsulated a lot of the issues. There's the cost of decarbonizing is already really high. And so I think it's imprudent to place too much burden on ultimately getting to the highest efficiency levels without really addressing the carbon emissions. I think we need to get into a mindset where the carbon emissions rise to the top of the priority the priority of the project, and that project is supported as much as possible by what we call supporting technologies or approaches that ultimately reduce the negative impacts of decarbonizing on the grid. And so we suggest really tempering the project requirements so that the decarbonization aspects are first and foremost. And then, of course, buildings have capital renewal requirements. Those need to be brought to bear. You need to protect the value of the asset. You need to keep the systems functioning properly. Ultimately, we have to get natural gas out in the long term. In the short term, lots of different pathways to get there and stepping stones to get there. But by the time 2050 rolls around, we shouldn't be combusting unabated fossil fuels anymore. And that needs to be on the ledger as a high priority.
And James, from your perspective, what do these trends and strategies mean for the landscape of building retrofit financing?
I mean, I guess there was a lot of really valuable stuff in Bryan's answer there. I would say, look, I think the middle market has been underserved historically in terms of financing retrofits. And what I mean by that is if you're a super big company that can aggregate 10, 15, 20 projects, you've got options, right? Historically, you could go to the CIB, and you could say, give me $120 million of your funding. And I know Max has experience with that. Or you could say, well, we want to do a green bond. We want to tap the debt capital markets to lower our cost of capital. And here is the basket of projects we're going to issue that green bond against. So that's for some of the larger kind of entities or bigger groups of projects. And at the other end, you've got, residential single family homes, which is, as Bryan pointed out, about half of the building related emissions in Canada. And there've been some fantastic, government schemes recently that have been oversubscribed, which is a good thing, to decarbonize single family homes. But when you get into that middle space, commercial and industrial, medium-sized multi-unit residential buildings, retail, kind of light manufacturing, stuff like that. There's really a bit of a gap in the, in the public and the private capital markets in terms of, what's being provided. Now, part of what we've done with, our retrofits partnership with CIB is trying to plug that gap, but more does need to be done.
Now, we've been talking a lot about some of the broad trends here, but Max, Avenue Living has a tangible example of undertaking the types of retrofits that we've been referring to. So I'm wondering if you can speak to your priorities at Avenue Living, as well as the retrofit initiatives that you're undertaking.
Yeah, absolutely, George. So for us, there's really, I call it 3 levels of retrofit, and we'll start with kind of the deepest and work down. So the first example is, kind of our deepest example of retrofit. And this is in partnership with BMO and the Canada Infrastructure Bank. We're doing a single project in Edmonton. It's a mid-rise concrete apartment building with a little bit of street retail and commercial space, 179 units. And what that project is a complete deep energy retrofit and renovation. So it's kind of unique in that respect of both tackling the underlying asset and the carbon emissions. So for Sunrise, the targeted emissions reduction is about between 60 and 65%. So I call that on the high end. We're not completely doing away with gas, but all of our suites are heated with heat pumps. We're bringing this really cool external panel solar system. So the entire exterior of the building will be active solar panels, and then a ton of other work. We're really excited about this project, but it combines both that renovation and retrofit. The second is our broader Canada Infrastructure Deep Energy Retrofit Program. So we've got total commitment of about $130, $140 million to spend on our Canadian portfolio. In that, we'll tackle several thousand units. The goal of that program is to reduce our emissions footprint in that basket of goods by about between 40 and 50%, I would say. That core infrastructure bank retrofit work is really focused on base building systems. So not a huge renovation element. We're really focusing on, okay, what is the boiler system? What is, makeup air? How are the windows? How are the envelopes? How are the roofs? And then targeting that sort of core emissions. And then the third level, and I call this kind of tactical work, is a handful of disparate programs that we've got across the portfolio in addition to those other two that just sort of, I call them, shallow retrofits, a good parallel, but, really looking at, okay, we did an acquisition of a relatively new portfolio in Edmonton. Upon due diligence, we realized that the energy, the electrical consumption was just like an anomaly. It's about 30% higher than it should be. So in those handful of properties, they're not very old, we're doing a sort of tactical electrical reduction program. So some sensors, lighting upgrades, handful of other things. So those are our 3 kind of big buckets of emissions priorities.
And in your experience, when is a good time in a building's life cycle to do these types of retrofits?
So a good time for us is, and what we've really instituted in the last few years, is looking at the end of life of certain systems. For example, we just closed on this property in Calgary. It's a 60s build, original windows. So those are at end of life. And so rather than just looking at, okay, well, let's just go through and do a window replacement program, what else can we do in that series of properties to reduce our emissions? So it's kind of, it can be the end of life of a boiler, end of life of makeup air, end of life of envelopes or roofs. But we usually try, and really what we've done in the last few years is take a single kind of end of life decision and make it a bigger contemplation. And that's where we found we're making the best decisions for both the underlying asset, but also the residents and the emissions profile.
Max, just a quick question from me actually to build on that. Like, is the maturity of the financing structure on the building a kind of material factor you think about when timing retrofits? And I guess what I mean by that is sometimes it would be an elegant way of refinancing the costs of the retrofits to roll them into a commercial mortgage. But obviously you don't want to break that mortgage midterm. And if the mortgage is currently on like 2.5% and, to break it and refinance it would involve going up to 5 point something or 6 point something, you might not want to do that. So is that something you guys think about, or is that a secondary factor, versus the equipment life cycle that you just described?
No, I think you're absolutely right, James. Like a financing event, and with the other, CMHC products around MLI, right, which is, on existing properties can be structured around emissions. We're actually working through an energy audit on an existing property in the portfolio here in Edmonton for that very reason. It's a 45-year-old property, good shape, but refi coming up, and we're looking at it and saying, hey, what if we did more here? What if we look at a reposition, make an investment, and then take advantage of some financing tools on the back end? So yeah, you're right. I would say I would put a financing event part and parcel with that end of life decision. It's just one of those decision points where you go, hold on, we could just go at this the normal way and, go conventional and do a takeout and move on, or we can kind of spend a bit more time, see what's available. Maybe there's some systems we can look at. Maybe there's a resident base that needs a bit more. Maybe there's something else here that we can tackle, kind of a series of issues as opposed to just one.
Yeah, and if I could jump in on that, like I think what I'm really hearing, it's not said explicitly, but you need to have a bit of a series of playbooks and sort of understanding the state of the assets in terms of capital renewal requirements and a state of the assets in terms of their energy use and their consumption profile. So this is the ongoing sort of data collection activities that are required, and then an overarching strategy for if this, then that, so that action can be taken based on those opportunities and events that arise in accordance with an overall sort of decarbonization strategy.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right. We've had the luxury of commissioning 60 energy audits now, and we've got wheels in flight on retrofits of different depths, but really breaking down as many scenarios as you can and then arriving at a goal as fast as you can is the secret sauce, because that informs every action after. How you're engaging with your finance. Okay, is this an MLI thing? Do we want to do also a renovation? Do we want to pull this into a deep energy retrofit? Are there some other things that we can tap into? Or maybe it's just, hey, like this property is using way too much electricity. What can we do for a low cost to just bring that down? But the faster you can arrive at that goal, the better all the knock-on steps are.
We were talking about like a playbook that considers all the factors, the financing, events, the end of life or the maturity of the equipment in the building. Like, I guess this is just a question back to both of you, is whose job is that to produce those playbooks? Is it, each company has to do their own? Whose job is it to produce those?
Well, I mean, there's the organizations such as mine that can help to, make templates for those sorts of things and advocate for their use. Ultimately, I think the large portfolio owners and really need to be pulling together multidisciplinary teams to make this a reality. We're seeing a lot of bigger players in the consulting field get into this area of really positioning the decarbonization as a longer term play, a roadmap process, rather than sort of one-off approach to retrofitting buildings. I remember quite a while ago now in my energy efficiency sort of programming days where we're just causing unlikely meetings to happen within organizations between the technical staff at a given operation and sort of the management and C-suite of those buildings. They just hadn't really communicated about financial criteria and about sort of what would direct the priority of investments. And the technical folks are certainly really clear on how the buildings perform and what they'd like to do, but really lacking guidance in terms of where the priorities need to be or what's possible. And so ultimately, the building owners need to, I think, take the full responsibility to recognize that that's required, but then bring in the assistance that's necessary to make cogent plan take shape. And I don't think it's the kind of thing that you just do once. I think organizations that are really doing this well now have been trying and doing different things over years to get to a spot where they feel comfortable with the strategy. And it's probably still very much in a state of evolution and trial and error to get the right outcomes that you want with a given investment.
Yeah, I'd say on that, just to build on it a bit internally, I kind of smash people together a little bit, and it's definitely interdisciplinary. We've got a little bit of an energy management group, asset management, capital, some engineering, but smashing them together with the financing group can be a challenge sometimes. Externally, I think there's a lot of room for these database, kind of catalyst organizations that, collect case studies and do education around retrofits and what the path looks like. I think for owners, that's really important. A lot of smaller owners, they're not going to have an energy manager, probably not going to have an engineer on staff, may not even have dedicated treasury or financing. So the shorter you can make their learning cycle, the more likely we are to have deep energy retrofits outside of large players, really pushing education on owners to say, hey, don't just replace that boiler when it dies. Take a second, see what you can do beyond that. And if you still land in the same place, fine. But if that's an opportunity where you're going to crystallize a 30, 40-year decision, that you could make some emissions reduction decisions.
Yeah, I would really jump in on plus one for that sort of capacity question, especially with the smaller buildings. You get it down into 50,000 square feet, 100,000 square feet. There's just no capacity, right, to really have the time to invest in learning all of these approaches and how things are kind of shifting, or what future liabilities might even look like in terms of building performance standards, or any of those sorts of important factors that should come into a decision. And lots of people are operating just on an emergency basis. They've got failed equipment, they've got to move and make a decision. And so the environment there is one where at the right moment they need to have the right information. And I think there's lots of organizations that are out there trying to pump that information out, and ours is one of them.
Thanks for listening to part 1 of our 2-part commercial retrofit series. Tune in to our next episode for part 2 of our discussion.
Thanks for listening to Sustainability Leaders. This podcast is presented by BMO. You can find our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. Press the follow button if you want to get notified when new episodes are published. We value your input, so please leave a rating, review, and any feedback that you might have, or visit us at bmo.com/sustainability leaders. Our show and resources are produced with support from BMO's marketing team and Puddle Creative. Until next time, thanks for listening, and have a great week.
For BMO disclosures, please visit bmocm.com/podcast/disclaimer.